Don't worry, a lot of people, including native New Yorkers, don't know the difference between a rent-controlled apartment and a rent-stabilized apartment. The big reason for this confusion is that a lot of time rent control is used in other parts of the country or, other states, but in New York it means something different. If this is your first time seeing me, my name is Alia Mohammed. I'm the co-founder of Open Igloo, and I share tips and info on renting in New York City, so be sure to give us a follow. So first things first, there's nearly 1 million rent-stabilized apartments in New York City, while there are only around 16,000 rent-controlled apartments. And these rent-controlled apartments will be found in buildings that were built before 1947, where there has been a continuous tenant since 1971. In order to get the rent-controlled status, you have to have been living in that apartment since 1971, which is why the majority of rent-controlled apartments in New York City are occupied by very elderly New Yorkers. And when that tenant dies or vacates the apartment becomes rent-stabilized, and anyone can rent that rent-stabilized apartment. But it will lose its rent-controlled status unless the person passes it down to someone who's been living with them in that apartment as their primary residence. And I can talk about succession rights in another video. Typically, you can find rent-stabilized apartments in buildings that are 6 units or more that were built before 1974. That's a general rule of thumb, but you can also find rent-stabilized apartments in brand new construction buildings. Another main difference between the two statuses is that when you're in a stabilized apartment, you will get a lease from your landlord. And the landlord will have to register you and the apartment every single year with DHCR. But if you are a rent-controlled tenant, you do not get a lease from your landlord, and that's because under the law, you're essentially considered a permanent tenant of that space. You do not need a lease. So while you cannot rent a rent-controlled apartment normally in the market, you can rent a rent-stabilized apartment normally in the market, and I encourage all of you to go to OpenIgloo.com and see what you can find.